Psychic self-defense. In the mind side of nature, invisible to our senses, intangible to our instruments of precision, many things can happen that are not without their echo on the physical plane. There are beings that live in this invisible world as fish live in the sea. There are men and women with trained minds or special aptitudes who can enter into this invisible world as a diver descends to the ocean bed. There are also times when, as happens to a land when the sea dikes break, the invisible forces flow in upon us and swamp our lives. Normally this does not occur. We are protected by our very incapacity to perceive these invisible forces. There are 4 conditions, however, in which the veil may be rent, and we may meet the unseen. We may find ourselves in a place where these forces are concentrated. We may meet people who are handling these forces. We may ourselves go out to meet the unseen, led by our interest in it, and get out of our depth before we know where we are. Or we may fall victim to certain pathological conditions which rend the veil. The threshold of the unseen is a treacherous coast on which to bathe. There are potholes and currents and quicksands. The strong swimmer who knows the coast may venture in comparative safety. The non-swimmer who takes counsel of nothing but his own impulses may pay for his temerity with his life. But we must not make the mistake of thinking that these invisible forces are necessarily evil and inimical to humanity. They are no more inimical in themselves than are water or fire, but they are potent. If we run counter to them, the result is disastrous for us, for we have broken a natural law. But they are not out to attack us any more than we are out to attack them. We must face the fact, however, that men and women with knowledge of these things have, both in the past and in the present, used that knowledge unscrupulously, and that we may find ourselves involved in the results of their actions. It may safely be said that the unseen is only evil and inimical to humanity when it has been corrupted and perverted by the activities of these unscrupulous men and women, whom initiates call adepts of the left-hand path. The commonest form of psychic attack is that which proceeds from the ignorant or malignant mind of our fellow human beings. We say ignorant as well as malignant, for all attacks are not deliberately motivated. The injury may be as accidental as that inflicted by a skidding car. This must always be borne in mind, and we should not impute malice or wickedness as a matter of course when we feel we are being victimized. Our persecutor may himself be a victim. We should not accuse a man of malice if we had linked hands with him and he had stepped on a live rail. Nevertheless, we should receive at his hands a severe shock. So it may be with many an occult attack. The person from whom it emanates may not have originated it. Therefore, we should never respond to attack by attack, thus bringing ourselves down to the moral level of our attackers, but rely upon more humane methods, which are in reality equally effectual and far less dangerous to handle. It may happen that the barrier between consciousness and subconsciousness is dense in some people, and they are never able to clearly realize what is going on. They merely have the sense of oppression and general malaise, which lifts when they go away to another place. Consequently, the condition may never be detected and lead to years of ill health and misery. More commonly, however, if there is a definite psychic attack of sufficient force to make itself noticeable at all, there will soon begin to appear characteristic dreams. These may include a sense of weight upon the chest, as if someone were kneeling on the sleeper. A sense of fear and oppression is very characteristic of occult attack, and one of the surest signs that herald it. It is extremely rare for an attack to make itself manifest out of the blue, as it were. We are not in our normal state of mind, body, and circumstance, and then find ourselves suddenly in the midst of an invisible battle. An approaching occult influence casts its shadow on consciousness before it makes itself apparent to the non-psychic. The reason for this is that we perceive subconsciously before we realize consciously, and a line of creeping shade indicates the penetrating of the subconscious sensor from below upwards. As the attack progresses, nervous exhaustion becomes increasingly marked, and there may, under certain conditions, which we will consider later, to be such wasting of the tissues that the victim is reduced to a mere bloodless shell of skin and bones lying on the bed, too weak to move, and yet no definite disease can be demonstrated. Such a case is an extreme example proceeding unchecked to its logical conclusion. Other issues are possible, however. The resistance may be good, in which case the attack is unable to gain a foothold on the physical plane and is limited to that borderland between matter and mind, which we perceive upon the threshold of sleep. This is a very terrible experience where the victim is afraid to sleep and cannot keep awake indefinitely. Worn out by fear and lack of sleep, mental breakdown soon supervenes. Evil odors are another manifestation of an astral attack. The characteristic smell is of decomposing flesh, and it comes and goes capriciously. But while it is manifesting, there is no doubt whatever about it, and anyone who is present can smell it, whether they are psychic or not. Another curious phenomenon is the precipitation of slime. I have not actually seen this myself, but I have first-hand information upon good authority of one such case. Odd footprints appearing from nowhere and leading nowhere are sometimes observed when there is snow about. I have seen them on 2 occasions on the roof of an outbuilding. There is a curious phenomenon known to occultists as the astral bell. This sound varies from a clear bell-like note to a faint click. I have often heard it resemble the sound made by striking a cracked wine glass with a knife blade. It commonly announces the advent of an entity that is barely able to manifest, and need not necessarily be a herald of evil at all. It may simply be a knock on the door of the physical world to attract the inhabitants to the presence of one who stands without and would speak with them. Inexplicable outbreaks of fire are also sometimes seen in this connection. These indicate that elemental forces, not human, are at work. Poltergeist phenomena also occur, in which objects are flung about, bells rung, and other noisy manifestations take place. Analysis of the nature of psychic attack. The essence of a psychic attack is to be found in the principles and operations of telepathic suggestion. If we put together what we know of telepathy and what we know of suggestion, we shall understand its modus operandi. Suggestion is one of 3 kinds: auto-suggestion, conscious suggestion, and hypnotic suggestion. The distinction, however, is not as fundamental as at first sight appears, for the goal of all suggestions in the subconscious mind is the same, and they do not become operative until it is reached. Suggestion is distinguished from threats and appeals to reason by the fact that these aim at a mark in the conscious mind. If they succeed, they owe their success to the acquiescence of the conscious personality, whether coerced or voluntary. But suggestion does not make its appeal to consciousness, but aims at laying its hands upon the springs of action in the subconsciousness and manipulating them from there. We might compare these 2 processes to the operation of pulling at the bell knob outside the front door and taking up a floorboard and twitching the bell wires themselves. The result will be the same in both cases. The bell will ring. Threats and argument pull the bell knob with varying degrees of emphasis. From the persistent tinkling of moral suasion to the resounding peal of the blackmailer, suggestion twitches the wires at various points in their course. Auto-suggestion is given by one's own conscious mind to one's own subconscious mind. Now you may ask, why can I not give orders to my subconscious mind direct, without having to resort to the paraphernalia of suggestion? The answer to this question is very simple. The subconscious mind belongs to a much earlier phase of evolution than the conscious mind. Belongs, in fact, to a phase prior to the development of speech. To address it in words, therefore, is like speaking to a man in a language he does not understand. In order to deal with him, we must have resort to sign language. So it is with the subconscious mind. It is of no use to say to it, do this or don't do that. We must make a mental picture of the thing we want done and hold it in consciousness till it begins to sink into the subconsciousness. The subconscious mind will understand this picture and act upon it. In order to handle the subconscious mind effectually, we make a mental picture of the thing we want done and hold it in mind by repeated applications until the subconscious begins to be influenced and takes up the task to its own accord. Hypnotic suggestion, which means literally suggestion made during sleep, and is to some extent a misnomer, is of three kinds. Firstly, true hypnotic suggestion, made when the subject has been rendered insensible by magnetic passes or fixation of the eyes on a bright object. Secondly, suggestion given during normal sleep. And thirdly, telepathic suggestion. All of these modes of suggestion enter the mind behind the sensor. That is to say, they are independent of consciousness, which is neither asked to cooperate nor has the power to inhibit them. In most cases, suggestions made in this way are never recognized as coming from outside, but are only discovered after they have matured in the subconsciousness and are beginning to take effect. We do not see the invisible seed that has been sown in our mind by the mind of another, but in due course germination takes place, and the strong growing shoot appears above the threshold of consciousness, as if it were a native growth. The skillful suggestionist always aims at making his suggestions harmonize with the bias of the personality, for if they do not, the established subconscious complexes will expel them before they have time to strike root. All he can really do is to reinforce and stimulate the ideas and impulses that are already there, though perhaps latent. He cannot plant an entirely alien seed. He cannot graft a rose shoot on a lilac bush, for it will merely wither and die. For growth of the thought seeds of suggestion to take place, they must find congenial soil. It is herein lies the strength of the defense. We may not be able to prevent the minds of others from sending us suggestions, but we may so purify the soil of our own natures that no harmful ones can find a congenial seedbed. It has been said, and not untruly, that a person cannot be hypnotized into doing anything which is contrary to his real nature. But what is the real nature of each one of us? Have we all overcome the ape and the tiger, or are they merely caged? Suggestion can unbar the cage of all of our secret temptations and let them loose upon us. None but the saint is naturally immune. Knowledge is necessary to protect, and it is that knowledge which I intend to give in these pages. Let us now consider how a psychic attack operates. In the realms of mind, there is neither time nor space as we understand them. If we think of a person, we are in touch with that person. If we picture them clearly, it is as if we were face to face with them. If we picture them vaguely, it is as if we saw them in the distance. Being in the mental vicinity of a person, we can create a thought atmosphere by dwelling upon certain ideas in connection with him. This is how spiritual healing is done. The affirmations of Christian Science are used in order to get the mind of a healer into a certain emotional state, and his condition effectually influences the mind of the patient with whom he has put himself en rapport, or in rapport. The primary aim of the suggestion is to create a mental atmosphere about the soul of the person, whether that person is to be attacked or healed, until a sympathetic response or reaction is elicited within the soul itself. I use the term soul to include both the mental and emotional processes, but to exclude the spiritual ones. Once this reaction is achieved, the battle is half over, for the gate of the city has been opened from within, and there can be free ingress. The telepathic suggestion of definite ideas can now proceed rapidly. It is this point which is the critical one in any occult attack. Up to this point, the defender has the advantage. If he has sufficient knowledge, the knowledge I hope to make available through this book, he can, without any undue exertion, retain that advantage indefinitely and wear his attackers down, even if unable to meet them on their own ground of occult knowledge. There are 2 gates, and only 2, by which the attacker can gain entrance to the city of the man-soul, and these are the self-preservation instinct and the sex instinct. The hypnotic appeal must be couched in terms of one or both of these if it is to be successful. How does the attacker proceed? He has to create an atmosphere about the soul of his victim on the inner planes. He can only do this while creating that atmosphere within his own consciousness, while he thinks of his victim. If he wants to perform a psychic murder, he must fill his own soul with the rage of destruction until it overflows. If he wants to perform a psychic rape, he must fill his soul with lust and cruelty. The cold rage of cruelty is essential to effectual operations of this nature. Now, what happens when he does this? He has sounded a ringing keynote in the abyss. It will be answered. All beings who have this keynote for this basis of their nature will respond. Dark Ariel and Azrael and Ammon on the wing, and will join in the operation. But they do not operate direct upon the victim. They work through the operator until the aura is pierced. There can be no entrance to the soul, and the aura is always pierced from within by the response of fear or desire going out towards the attacking entity. If we can inhibit that instinctive emotional reaction, the edge of the aura will remain impenetrable and will be as sure a defense against psychic invasion as the healthy and unbroken skin is a defense against bacterial infection. It happens sometimes, however, that a rapport has been formed with the attacking entity in a previous incarnation, and therefore it holds as it were the key to the postern. Such a problem is a very difficult one, and external assistance is needed for its solution. The difficulty is increased by the fact that the victim is often disinclined to allow the break to be made, being bound to the attacking entity, whether discarnate or incarnate, by bonds of fascination or even genuine affection. We must consider the subject of etheric projection. In this case, not only is the mind at work, but also something which is pretty nearly physical. Sufficiently physical at any rate, to leave bruises on the flesh of the victim, throw the furniture about, or at least make a considerable amount of noise. Where such manifestations take place, it is obvious that we are dealing with something more substantial than the mind, for though mind can influence mind, and through it the body, to an extent to which, in the present state of our knowledge, it is difficult to set limits. Mind cannot manipulate matter directly, that is to say, you cannot smash a window by means of a thought. There must be some physical vehicle that can be manipulated by the mind if effects are to be wrought on the physical plane. The living body is such an instrument. It is manipulated by the mind every time a voluntary movement takes place. And the operations of spiritual healing are simply an extension of this principle to the involuntary muscles and physiological processes not ordinarily directed by the conscious mind. Occultists maintain that mind affects body by means of the etheric double, as it is called, the mortal mind of the Christian scientists. We may not unreasonably conclude that when physical action is produced at a distance by occult means, it is done by employing this etheric double. The etheric double is primarily a body of magnetic stresses, in the framework of whose meshes every cell and fiber of the physical body is held as in a rack, but intermediate between this and the dense physical body as we know it, there is what may be called the raw material out of which dense matter is condensed. This was called by the ancients hyle, or first matter, and by the moderns ectoplasm. It is this projected ectoplasm which produces the phenomena whenever physical manifestations are in question. The adept who is head of the occult college, from whom I received my first training in occultism, was able to perform this operation, and I have many times seen him do it. He would go into a deep trance after a few convulsive movements, somewhat like a slow tetany, and would then lose about 2/3 of his weight. What became of the missing weight on these occasions I found out one night. He had been ill with some delirium, and the lion's share of the nursing, especially the night work, had fallen to my lot. There came a time, however, when we decided that he was so far recovered that it was unnecessary for anyone to sit up with him. So to bed we all went, for the first time in several days. I shared a room with another member of the community. It was a comparatively small cottage we were in, and our 2 beds were close together, side by side, right under the uncurtained, open window. It was the time of the full moon, and I remember that I had no need to light a candle in order to see to undress. I fell asleep at once, for I was very tired. I could not have been asleep very long, however, when I was awakened by the sensation of a weight upon my feet. It was as if a good-sized dog, say a collie, had jumped up and lain down on the bed. The room was flooded with moonlight and as bright as day, and I clearly saw, lying apparently asleep across the foot of my bed, the man whom we had left safely tucked up for the night in the room below. It was a somewhat embarrassing situation, and I lay still taking thought before I did anything. I was wide enough awake by now, as may well be imagined. I concluded that Zed, as I will call this man, had either had a return of the delirium or was sleepwalking. In any case, I was very anxious to get him safely back to bed, again without a fuss or a scene. Zed was plainly visible in the moonlight, clad apparently in his dressing gown, or so I took the muffling folds of material to be that swathed him about. Both his face and wrapping appeared gray and colorless in the moonlight, but there was no question in my mind as to his solidarity, for not only could I see him, but I could feel his weight resting upon my feet. But the moment I moved, he vanished, and I was left staring in amazement at the smooth fold of the blankets over the end of the little camp bed on which I lay. This, of course, was in no way an occult attack, but rather the visit of a friend who had come to lean upon me in the course of his illness, and instinctively came to me for consolation when out of his body in trance at a time when his weakened condition prevented him from retaining his normal control over his psychic activities. Nevertheless, it serves to illustrate what could be done if the etheric form that visited me had been energized by a malignant will. It may explain the nature of the sense of weight that oppresses the victims of a certain type of nightmare. It is a well-known fact that if an occultist functioning out of the body meets with unpleasantness on the astral plane, or if his subtle body is seen and struck or shot at, the physical body will show the marks. I myself have many times found curiously patterned bruises on my body after an astral skirmish. The mechanism of the production of such marks must, I think, be of the same nature as that which produces the stigmata of saints and the curious physical marks and swelling sometimes seen in hysterics. The mind, powerfully stirred, affects the etheric double, and the etheric double acts upon the physical molecules held in its meshes. The next type of psychic attack which we must consider is that conducted by means of artificial elementals. These are distinguished from thought forms by the fact that, once formulated by the creative mind of the magician, they possess a distinct and independent life of their own, though strictly conditioned as to nature by the concept of their creator. The life of these creatures is akin to that of an electric battery. It slowly leaks out by means of radiation, and unless recharged periodically, will finally weaken and die out. The whole question of the making, charging, recharging, or destruction of these artificial elements is an important one. In practical occultism, the artificial elemental is constructed by forming a clear-cut image in the imagination of the creature it is intended to create, ensoling it with something of the corresponding aspect of one's own being, and then invoking into it the appropriate natural force. This method can be used for good as well as evil, and guardian angels are formed in this way. It is said that dying women, anxious concerning the welfare of their children, frequently form them unconsciously. I myself had an exceedingly nasty experience in which I formulated a werewolf accidentally. Unpleasant as the incident was, I think it may be just as well to give it publicity, for it shows what may happen when an insufficiently disciplined and purified nature is handling occult forces. I had received serious injury from someone who, at considerable cost to myself, I had disinterestedly helped, and I was sorely tempted to retaliate. Lying on my bed resting one afternoon, I was brooding over my resentment, and while so brooding drifted towards the borders of sleep. There came to my mind the thought of casting off all restraint and going berserk. The ancient Nordic myths rose before me, and I thought of Fenris, the wolf horror of the north. Immediately I felt a curious drawing out sensation from my solar plexus, and there materialized beside me on the bed a large wolf. It was a well-materialized ectoplasmic form. Like Zed, it was gray and colorless, and like him, it had weight. I could distinctly feel its back pressing against me as it lay beside me on the bed, as a large dog might. I knew nothing about the art of making elementals at that time, but had accidentally stumbled upon the right method, the brooding, highly charged with emotion, the invocation of the appropriate natural force, and the condition between sleeping and waking, in which the etheric double readily extrudes. I was horrified at what I had done, and I knew that I was in a tight corner, and that everything depended upon my keeping my head. I had had enough experience of practical occultism to know that the thing I had called into visible manifestation could be controlled by my will, provided I did not panic. But that if I lost my nerve and it got the upper hand, I had a Frankenstein monster to cope with. I stirred slightly, and the creature evidently objected to being disturbed, for it turned its long snout towards me, over its shoulder, and snarled, showing its teeth. I had now got the wind up properly, but I knew that everything depended on my getting the upper hand and keeping it, and that the best thing I could do was to fight it out now, because the longer the thing remained in existence, the stronger it would get, and the more difficult to disintegrate. So I drove my elbow into its hairy ectoplasmic ribs and said to it out loud, "If you can't behave yourself, you will have to go on the floor," and pushed it off the bed. Down it went meek as a lamb, and changed from wolf to dog, to my great relief. Then the northern corner of the room appeared to fade away, and the creature went out through the gap. I was far from happy, however, for I had a feeling that this was not the end of it, and my feeling was confirmed when next morning another member of my household reported that her sleep had been disturbed by dreams of wolves, and she had awakened in the night to see the eyes of a wild animal shining in the darkness in the corner of her room. Thoroughly alarmed, I went to seek advice from one whom I have always looked upon as my teacher, and was told that I had made this thing out of my own substance by revengeful thoughts, and that it was really a part of myself extruded, and that I must, at all costs, recall it and reabsorb it into myself, at the same time foregoing my desire to settle accounts with the person who had injured me. Curiously enough, just at this time, there came an opportunity most effectually to settle, quote-unquote, with my antagonist. Fortunately for all concerned, I had enough sense left to see that I was at the dividing of the ways, that if I were not careful, would take the first step on the left-hand path. If I availed myself of the opportunity to give practical expression to my resentment, the wolf form would be born into an independent existence, and there would be the devil to pay, literally as well as metaphorically. I received the distinct impression, and impressions are important things in psychic matters, for they often represent subconscious knowledge and experience, that once the wolf impulse had found expression in action, the wolf form would sever the psychic navel cord that connected it with my solar plexus, and it would be no longer possible for me to absorb it. The prospect was not a pleasant one. I had to forego my dearly loved revenge, and allow harm to be done to me without defending myself, and I also had to summon and absorb a wolf form which, to my psychic consciousness at any rate, looked unpleasantly tangible, nor was it a situation which I could either ask for assistance or expect much sympathy. However, it had to be faced, and I knew that every hour of the thing's existence it would be harder to deal with. So so I made the resolution to let the opportunity for revenge slip through my fingers, and at first dusk summoned the creature. It came in through the northern corner of the room again. Subsequently, I learned that the north was considered among the ancients as the evil quarter, and presented itself upon the hearthrug in quite a mild and domesticated mood. I obtained an excellent materialization in the half-light, and could have sworn that a big Alsatian was standing there looking at me. It was tangible, even to the dog-like odor. From it to me stretched a shadowy line of ectoplasm. One end was attached to my solar plexus, and the other disappeared in the shaggy fur of its belly, but I could not see the actual point of attachment. I began by an effort of the will and imagination to draw the life out of it along the silver cord, as if sucking lemonade up a straw. The wolf form began to fade, and the cord thickened and grew more substantial. A violent emotional upheaval started in myself. I felt the most furious impulses to go berserk and rend and tear anything and anybody that came to hand, like the Malay running amok. I conquered this impulse with an effort, and the upheaval subsided. The wolf form had now faded into a shapeless, gray mist. This too absorbed along the silver cord. The tension relaxed, and I found myself bathed in perspiration. That, as far as I know, was the end of the incident. I had had a sharp lesson, and a highly instructive one. It may not be convincing to other people owing to the lack of corroborative evidence, but it was exceedingly evidential to me, and I put it on record for what it is worth to those who, having personal knowledge of these things, can see its significance. It is a curious point that, during the brief 24 hours of the thing's life, the opportunity for an effectual vengeance presented itself. The alleged vampire has always been a popular character in tales of mystery and imagination. When psychoanalysis was first introduced into England, I took up this subject and became a student, and eventually a lecturer, at a clinic that was founded in London. We students were soon struck by the fact that some cases were exceedingly exhausting to deal with. I came across a number of cases in which a morbid attachment existed between two people, most commonly mother and daughter, or two women friends. It was always the negative one of the pair who came for treatment, and we were able to benefit them considerably by psychotherapeutic means. At the time, I explained everything in terms of the Freudian psychology, but even so I could not help being struck by the curious effect a separation had upon the person who was not supposed to be ill, and that as the one went uphill, the other went down. I am of the opinion that what Freud calls an Oedipus complex is not altogether a one-sided affair, and that the soul of the parent is drawing upon the psychic vitality of the child. It is curious how aged Oedipus cases always look, and what little old men and women they are as children. They never have a normal childhood, but always are mentally mature for their years. Knowing what we do of telepathy and of the magnetic aura, it appears to me not unreasonable to suppose that in some way, which we do not yet fully understand, the negative partner of such a rapport is shorting onto the positive partner. There is a leakage of vitality going on, and the dominant partner is more or less consciously lapping it up, if not actually sucking it out. Such cases are by no means uncommon, and clear up rapidly when the victim is separated from the vampire. Whenever there is a record of a close or dominating bond between two people with the devitalization of one of them, it is a good plan to recommend a temporary separation and observe the results. Such cases as these, however, may be more justly be described as parasitism than vampirism. Such psychic parasitism is exceedingly common and explains many psychological problems. We will not pursue the subject in these pages, however, as it is outside the scope of our present enquiry and is merely mentioned for illustrative purposes. Vampirism, as generally understood, is a very different matter, and we shall do well to reserve the term for those cases wherein the attack is deliberate, applying the term parasitism to those cases wherein it is unconscious and involuntary. In my opinion, true vampirism cannot take place unless there is power to project the etheric double. All the records of vampirism that we have give an account of something much more tangible than a haunting. In Western Europe, the occurrence seems to be comparatively rare in modern times, but in Eastern Europe and in primitive countries it appears by no means uncommon, and innumerable well-authenticated cases occur in books of travel. Commander Gould, in his exceedingly interesting book Oddities, gives an account of vampirism among the Burbanglings of the Philippine Islands. His account is based on a paper printed in the Journal of the Asiatic Society. These unpleasant people, according to Mr. Skirchley, the author of the article which Commander Gould quotes, are ghouls and must eat human flesh occasionally or they would die. When they feel a craving for a meal of human flesh, they go away into the grass, and having carefully hidden their bodies, hold their breaths, and fall into a trance. Their astral bodies are then liberated. They fly away and entering a house, make their way into the body of one of the occupants, and feed on his entrails. Compare Mr. Skirchley's account of the Berberlings lying in the long grass and throwing themselves into trance with Mr. Muldoon's account of the projection of the astral body, which every student of occultism ought to be familiar, for it is undoubtedly a classic of occult literature, being a practical account of occult experiences and detailed instructions how to go and do likewise. In the course of my experience, I have only known one case of genuine vampirism. At that time, I was doing the tutorials in abnormal psychology at the clinic I have spoken of, and supervising the work of other students. One of them took counsel with me concerning a case that had come to her in private practice, the case of a youth in the late teens, one of those degenerate but intellectual and socially presentable types that not infrequently crop up in old families whose blood is too blue to be wholesome. This lad was taken as boarder in a flat which the student shared with another woman, and they soon began to be troubled with curious phenomena. About the same time every evening, the dogs in the neighboring mews began a furious outcry of barking and howling, and a few moments later, the French window leading to the veranda would open. It did not matter how often they got the locksmith to it, nor how they barricaded it. Open it would come at the appointed time, and a cold draught sweep through the flat. This phenomenon took place one evening when the adept Zed was present, and he declared that an unpleasant invisible entity had entered. They lowered the lights and were able to see a dull glow in the corner he indicated, and when they put their hands into this glow, felt a tingling sensation, such as is experienced when the hands are put into electrically charged water. Then began a mighty spook hunt up and down the flat. The boy, whom we will call D, was in the habit of going to sit with a cousin who had been invalided home from France, suffering from alleged shell shock. D had always been under the impression that some ghost attacked him during his crises, but had dared not to say so for fear of being thought mad. What may have been the exact percentage of neurotic taint, vice, and psychic attack, it is difficult to say, nor is it easy to decide which was the predisposing cause that opened the door to all the trouble. But one thing stood out clearly to all beholders, that with the dispatch of the psychic visitant, not only did D's condition clear up immediately, but after a short, sharp upheaval the cousin also recovered. The method of dispatch used by the adept Zed was to pin the entity inside a magic circle so that it could not get away, and then absorb it into himself through compassion. As he completed the operation, he fell over backwards unconscious. It was in fact the same method that I was instructed to use in dealing with my werewolf, but it is a much more formidable task to absorb and transmute the projection of another person than to absorb one's own, and could only have been accomplished by an initiate of a very high grade, which Zed indubitably was. His opinion concerning the case, though there was no means of obtaining independent confirmation of this, was that some Eastern European troops had been brought to the Western Front, and among these were individuals with the traditional knowledge of black magic, for which southeastern Europe has always enjoyed a sinister reputation. among occultists. These men getting killed knew how to avoid going to the second death, that is to say, the disintegration of the astral body, and maintained themselves in the etheric double by vampirizing the wounded. Now, vampirism is contagious. The person who is vampirized being depleted of vitality is a psychic vacuum, himself absorbing from anyone he comes across in order to refill his depleted resources of vitality. He soon learns by experience the tricks of a vampire without realizing their significance, and before he knows where he is a full-blown vampire himself, vampirizing others. The earthbound soul of a vampire sometimes attaches itself permanently to one individual if it succeeds in making a functioning vampire of him, systematically drawing its etheric nutriment from him, for since he is in his turn resupplying himself from others, he will not die from exhaustion as victims of vampires do in the ordinary way. Zed was of the opinion that Dee's cousin was not the primary vampire in the case, but was himself a victim. Being a youth of unstable morale, he speedily acquired the vampire tricks, and the earthbound soul of some Magyar magician exploited him. Through his act of biting and drawing blood from the neck of his cousin, this entity became transferred to the young Dee, preferring pastures new to the depleted resources of its previous victim. Probably it alternated between the two, for it was not constantly with Dee. Exactly what Zed did we do not know, for he was exceedingly secretive concerning his methods. But in the light of subsequent knowledge, I should imagine that he absorbed the etheric energy of the earthbound soul, and thus deprived it of some of its means of resisting the second death, merely to drive the resisting soul out to the judgment hall of Osiris would have involved leaving behind an astral corpse, which for some time would have continued to give trouble. It may be interesting to note in connection with this case that during the time that Miss L was at the occult college in Hampshire, we had some rather curious happenings. There was an outbreak among us of exceedingly bad mosquito bites. The bites themselves were not poisonous, but the stabs were of such a nature that they bled freely. I remember waking up one morning to find a patch of blood, the size of the palm of my hand, on the pillow. It had apparently come from a small puncture just behind the angle of the jaw. Several others had similar experiences. I have never seen anything like it, either before or since, nor did it occur again after Miss L left. I did not tell the adept Zed about it at the time, and later, when I was reminded of the incident and mentioned it, the opportunity for investigation had gone by. He expressed the opinion that it was a vampire's work and cited similar cases, which he had met with in the course of his experience. He said he had seen cases in Africa where the victim had become so bloodless that it was with difficulty that a specimen of blood could be obtained for examination, where it could hardly be induced to flow within the debilitated tissue. Nothing can be done for such cases by medical science. They are dying by inches, and yet no organic disease can be demonstrated. Nevertheless, their appearance is that of a person sinking from repeated hemorrhages. When vampirism is suspected, the thing to do is to go over the person's body inch by inch with a powerful magnifying glass, and the search will probably be rewarded by the discovery of numerous minute punctures, so minute that they are not discovered by an examination with the naked eye unless they reveal themselves by becoming infected and suppurating, and when they are usually mistaken for insect bites. They are bites right enough, but not those of an insect. The places to look for them are around the neck, especially under the ears, down the inner surface of the forearms, on the lobes of the ears. It is said that a woman with vampire tendencies develops abnormally long and sharp canine teeth, and I have myself seen one such case, and a curious sight it was. True vampirism in Western Europe appears to be rare, but Zed was of the opinion that many obscure cases of tropical debility, in which anemia played a prominent part, might be attributed to this cause. There are two forms of haunting which have to be considered. The one which is due to a discarnate soul who interferes with a particular person, and the one which is due to the conditions prevailing in a particular place, and which affects any person sufficiently sensitive who happens to go there, except in cases where the influence is exceptionally strong. The insensitive person is immune. To perceive a haunting, one needs, as a general rule, to be slightly psychic. Let us consider first of all the question of interference by a discarnate soul. It will be noted that I use the term interference and not attack. The disturbance need not necessarily be an attack, any more than the drowning man who clings to his rescuer and drags him under is motived by malice. The entity that is causing the trouble may be a soul that is itself in distress on the inner planes and is too ignorant of post-mortem conditions to know the harm it is doing by clinging so desperately. To the living, it is for this reason that the wide dissemination of spiritualistic teaching is of value, for it helps to relieve the tension between this world and the next. As far as my experience goes, I am inclined to think that deliberate malevolence is rare, but this panic-stricken clinging is not uncommon, and explains why the survivor of a pair sometimes goes through very unpleasant experiences after the death of the partner. There are cases, though rarer, wherein a soul who has some occult knowledge, but is bound strongly to earth by sensual desires, uses a curious form of rapport in order to gratify those desires through the physical body of another. With respect to the type of haunting in which it is the place which is the focus of manifestation, not a special person, we must distinguish between the earthbound entity which remains attached to a particular spot and the thought atmosphere which is left behind after violent emotions have been experienced there. Let us consider first the question of thought atmosphere, which can give a very illuminating example. A friend of mine who was a student at a school of dramatic art consulted me concerning an attack of stage fright she had had, which left her rather nervous as to its recurrence. She was an experienced student, in fact a pupil teacher, and she was having some extra tuition from the head of the school. Going for her lesson one afternoon, she found her teacher had just finished taking the junior students for their end-of-term examination and elocution. She went onto the stage and stood beside a small table, which had been placed there for the convenience of the examiner, and commenced to recite the piece on which she was to have her lesson. She herself had no occasion for nervousness. As had already been noted, she was an experienced speaker and teacher. Moreover, nothing of importance hung upon this lesson. It was merely one of a series, nor was she usually nervous or self-conscious. But as soon as she tried to start, she experienced a complete dry up and stood paralyzed, unable to utter a word. A little prompting soon started her off, however, but she had experienced a nasty attack of stage fright, and it shook her nerve. From the psychic point of view, the explanation was not far to seek. She was standing in the mental atmosphere created by a series of girls who had gone on to that platform for an examination upon which a good deal depended for them, and who had all been correspondingly nervous. She herself, being sensitive, had been affected by this atmosphere, which induced in her a similar mental state by means of what is called sympathetic induction, a phenomenon well known in electricity and in acoustics, but equally valid in psychology. No doubt the unfortunate examinees themselves were infecting each other. It may well be that the microphone panic, so well known to broadcasters, is caused by the thought atmosphere generated by a succession of nervous people who have stood upon the same spot. An experience of my own may be of interest in this connection. I took a bed-sitting room in a hostel, and as soon as I came there I found myself afflicted with the most intense depression. I am not usually subject to the blues, being normally a cheerful soul, but as soon as I entered this room, which was a sunny and pleasant one, the cloud descended upon me, but lifted again as soon as I went out of it, whether into the dining room of the hostel or out of doors. I soon recognized that here was something that needed to be dealt with, and inquired as to the history of the room. I was told that it had previously been the bedroom of the last owner of the house, who had been addicted to drink and had gone bankrupt. It is a curious fact that drunkards and drug addicts make very evil psychic atmospheres, whereas a person who is a common criminal, however bad, is not nearly so noxious, and his atmosphere fades rapidly. It is not altogether an easy matter to determine whether the disturbance is due to atmosphere alone or whether an earthbound entity complicates the situation. Where an entity is present, it will usually be seen sooner or later. Moreover, it will usually be heard as well as felt. This latter sign, however, does not invariably indicate the presence of an organized entity, for I know of a case wherein a room that had been used as a lodge of ritual initiation was subsequently partitioned into an office and 2 bedrooms after the lodge was moved elsewhere, and the bedrooms were practically uninhabitable owing to the din of cracks, bangs, and thumpings that went on at night. In such a case, there was no reason to suspect the presence of any entity, for the rituals had not been of an evocative type, nor was the influence evil. It was merely force in a state of tension. It was sheer physical noise that made the disturbance, as I can testify, for I have slept, or rather tried to sleep there. Where a ghost is seen, it is usually also heard, because for a form to be sufficiently substantial, to be visible, there must be a modicum, at least, of ectoplasm in its composition. An ectoplasm is capable of exercising force on the physical plane, in some degree at least. It is well known to all psychics that the sites of ancient temples, where mystery rituals have been worked, are always potently charged with psychic force. This force need not necessarily be evil, but it has a powerfully stimulating effect upon the psychic centers and stirs up the subconscious forces. And as the majority of civilized people suffer, in a greater or lesser degree, from what Freud calls repression, such a stirring of the subliminal mind produces a feeling of profound disturbance. We should not unquestioningly attribute evil influence to a place or a person that causes us discomfort. It may merely be that psychic force at a greater tension than we are accustomed to is disturbing our equilibrium. The rituals of the church are, of course, ceremonial magic, as is admitted by even such an orthodox authority as Evelyn Underhill. The average clergyman is not conversant with the technique of occultism, and has therefore little or no understanding of what he is doing. What influences he brings to the altar and what forces he takes away therefrom must therefore be an open question in each individual case. A man whose consciousness has been exalted by ritual and who does not know how to seal his aura and return to normal is liable to psychic invasion. Objects associated with any form of ceremonial operations are invariably highly charged, with magnetism intimately linked with the force whose uses they have served. But the Christian is not the only religion that can magnetize its ceremonial instruments. There are other ritualistic religions, and some of these are debased. We ought to use much caution before we place about our rooms as ornaments objects which may have been associated with cults whose nature we do not understand. I had an example of this once in the British Museum. I was visiting the room in the basement, which contains a collection of plaster casts of the famous statues of antiquity, the originals being elsewhere. Suddenly I became aware of a sense of magnetic power. I turned towards it and saw a small altar. Reading the label, I saw that this was not a cast, but the original. It is a very interesting test of psychism to sample the atmosphere of the different rooms of the British Museum. Magnetism, which is dispersed during the day, charges up again during the silence and darkness of the night. I remember visiting Stonehenge amid a crowd of trippers and charabancs, and thinking that the glory had departed. But it was a very different affair when I visited it in the desolation of a bleak spring day after its long winter solitude. It had charged up again and was as formidable as anyone could wish. There are many Europeans who have a great affection for the Buddha and have his statue in their rooms. That the influence of the great being, the light of Asia, is noble and benignant, I would be the last to deny, but the statues of the Buddha are a different matter, and need to be approached with caution if genuine. Some of the worst black magic in the world is a debased form of Buddhism. To say this is not to insult that venerable faith, for it is only lack of opportunity that prevents the black mass from occupying that dubious eminence. In the Tibetan monasteries of the Dugpa sect, there are temples, each one of which contained literally thousands of statues of the Buddha. On various occasions, one or another of these monasteries has been raided, either by rival religionists or Chinese troops, and its curios scattered to be the possessor of one of these Buddhas magnetized by Dugpa rites is not a very pleasant thing. It is not every case of psychic disturbance, however, which originates externally. It is a well-known cosmic law that everything moves in circles, and whatever forces we send out, and whatever thought forms we extrude from our auras, unless absorbed by the object to which they are directed, will return to us in due course. One of the most effective, and also one of the most widely practiced methods of occult defense is to refuse to react to an attack, neither accepting nor neutralizing the forces projected against one, and thus turning them back on their sender. We must never overlook the fact that a so-called occult attack may be evil thought forms returning home to roost. There are certain types of insanity in which the lunatic believes himself to be the victim of an attack by invisible beings who threaten and abuse him and offer base or dangerous insinuations. He will describe his tormentors or point to their position in the room. A psychic who investigates such a case can very often see the alleged entities just where the lunatic says they are. Nevertheless, the psychologist can come forward and prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the so-called hallucinations are due to repressed instincts, giving rise to dissociated complexes of ideas in the patient's own subconscious mind. Does this mean that the psychic is mistaken in thinking he perceives an astral entity? In my opinion, both psychic and psychologist are right, and their findings are mutually explanatory. What the psychic sees is the dissociated complex extruded from the aura as a thought form. A great deal of relief can be given to lunatics by breaking up the thought forms that are surrounding them. But unfortunately, the relief is short-lived, for unless the cause of the illness can be dealt with, a fresh batch of thought forms is built up as soon as the original ones are destroyed. Chapter 3, The Pathology of Non-Human Contacts. There are other forms of life, as well as ours, whose sphere of evolution impinges upon the earth. In the realm of folklore, we constantly meet with the idea of intercourse between the human and the fairy kingdoms, of the marriage of a human being with a fairy spouse, or the theft of a child by the fairies, an impish changeling being left in its place. We shall be rash if we assume that an extensive body of folk belief is entirely without foundation in fact. Let us therefore examine these old and crude beliefs and see whether we find any ground for them. There are many of us who have met people who might well be described as non-human, soulless, in that the ordinary human motives are not operative with them, nor do the ordinary human feelings prompt or inhibit them. We cannot but love them, for they have great charm, but we cannot but dread them as well, for they spread an infinitude of suffering around them. While seldom deliberately evil, they are singularly detrimental to all with whom they come in contact. Gratitude, compassion, good faith, morality, and common honesty are utterly foreign to their natures. They are not immoral, however, but simply non-moral. On the other hand, they possess the virtues of absolute sincerity and great courage. In terms of human ethics, they are undesirables, but they have an ethic of their own, to which they are loyal, and that is the beauty which is truth. And this is all they know, and as far as their life is concerned, all they need to know. In appearance, they are usually small and slight, possessing unusual physical strength and endurance, but very liable to nervous exhaustion and brainstorms and social relations. They take violent likes and dislikes. They show a facile and demonstrative affection towards those they like, but quickly forget them. Towards those they dislike, they are pettily malicious, and in all relations of life they are utterly irresponsible. I have been able to investigate the history of two such beings, and it is interesting to note that both of them were conceived while their mothers were under the influence of drink. There is a very great deal of information available concerning the occult aspect of the incarnation of souls, but not much of the knowledge concerning the actual facts of conception has ever found its way into print. I have given a little in my book, The Esoteric Philosophy of Love and Marriage. Some points are essential to touch upon for a comprehensive survey of our subject. At the moment of sexual union, a psychic vortex is formed resembling a waterspout, a funnel-shaped swirling that towers up into other dimensions. As body after body engages, the vortex goes up the planes. In all cases, the physical, etheric, and astral bodies are involved. The vortex therefore always reaches as far as the astral plane. A soul upon the astral plane may be drawn into this vortex, if it is ripe for incarnation, and thus enter the sphere of the parents. If the vortex extends higher than the astral plane, souls of a different type may enter this sphere. But such an extension is rare, and therefore it is said that man is born of desire, for few are born of anything else. But this vortex may not only extend vertically up the planes, speaking metaphorically, but it may also, under certain conditions, be deflected, as it were, out of the normal human line of evolution, so that its open end extends into the sphere of evolution of another type of life. Under such circumstances, it is theoretically possible for a being of parallel evolution to be drawn into incarnation, into a human body. Occultists hold that this occasionally occurs and explains certain types of non-pathological abnormality which are occasionally met with. These non-humans are either adored or hated by their human associates. They have a peculiar fascination for certain types of temperament, the types that psychologists call the unstable. In these types, the subconscious comes very near to the surface. Deep calls to the deep, and they are instinctively drawn towards the elemental kingdoms. There is nothing more disastrous than marriage with a non-human, for they have nothing in their nature that can satisfy the normal human yearnings for affection and sympathy. The power of non-humans to injure their enemies is comparatively small. They seem to have an infinite capacity for inflicting hurt on those who love them, though. Not deliberately or maliciously, but like a child pulling flies to pieces out of idleness. The effect they have upon those who love them constitutes such a well-marked syndrome among the psychic pathologies that we must consider it in detail. The person who forms a rapport with a non-human becomes deeply stirred by the elemental forces that find ingress to our sphere through the channel of this wandering and alien soul. He becomes, as it were, drawn away from normal human things and set wandering upon the confines of the fairy kingdom, and yet he can find there no rest for his foot and no sustenance for his soul. Human beings may also come into touch with elemental beings by themselves, venturing into the spheres of elemental life. Such contacts need not necessarily be harmful to either kingdom, provided those who enter into them know what they are about. There are cases, however, where such an association may lead to harm. The human partner in the association may be ill-equipped or ill-adapted for the undertaking. He may have ventured out beyond his depth, having picked up a formula from some more experienced occultist, and used it without proper preparation. Or again, it is not uncommon to find people who have brought through from previous incarnations a natural aptitude for getting into touch with the elemental kingdoms. In such cases, it may occur that an elemental who has had experience of relations with human beings may deliberately get into touch with them. This is in every way undesirable, for the elemental has not got the knowledge of human conditions necessary to enable it to avoid injuring its new friend. In any case, elementals have got a one-way intelligence, and it is not well that they should be senior partners in any alliance with human beings. Persons in whom the subconscious mind is near the surface, such as the artist, the crank, the unstable, and for the matter of that, the genius in any walk of life, love the elemental contacts because they stimulate the elemental forces in their own nature, which are to them the springs of their power and inspiration. Any organic geographical unit develops something of an oversoul, and where the differentiation is marked, the oversoul may become a very definite entity. If there are among the inhabitants of the district any who are sensitive to the unseen, they may form either an affinity or a repulsion for this oversoul. A great forest has a very marked personality, and there are few white men who can resist its influence, becoming markedly changed and dehumanized if exposed to it for long periods, without the companionship of others of their race. Natives, on the other hand, seem to enter into it and be part of it.